it to keep growing, but obviously it matters now. Those are big numbers. But so how can you get in on this? How those are cool numbers. People are listening to them. They're reacting. People are spending more money. So how could that's always get that question? How in the competition people were wondering, and I really was thinking about it, and really some people would benefit from starting their own podcast. Some people would benefit from being a guest on a podcast, and some people would benefit from advertising on a podcast. And I feel, again, if you're a service-based company or you offer a service, you have to become an influencer. That you have to, make blogs, podcasts, let people know, hey, you need to hire me to run your Twitter account because I'm an expert on Twitter. Whenever I make a post, people react to it. And also starting a podcast if you're a service-based company. Again, if there was an Ascend podcast and I needed help, I would immediately say, well, I listen to whoever the host is and I like that company. So I think service-based companies would benefit greatly from starting a podcast or finding someone within their company that they can make an influencer on social media. And also, of course, sponsoring a podcast. As a podcast producer, we'll take any money that we can take. But for service-based companies, I really, starting a podcast, either figuring it out on your own or reaching out to a company like ours that we can help get you going. Service-based companies, you need to seem like an expert, and that really helps. I believe, or we believe, to really drive expansion. And retail companies, if you have a mom and pop store, if you have a feed store or a flower shop or something, you probably wouldn't benefit from starting a podcast. It's just way too much effort. But you also find a relevant podcast in your area. And as a podcaster, that's one thing that the industry that we've as creators have not done great yet. If someone says, oh, I like gardening, and how do I find a gardening podcast? As creators, we go, and Google is finally jumped in on the podcasting, and that's really helping to kind of guide and help people find new podcasts. But once again, for you guys or for anyone local, there's us. People can call us and say, hey, I have a gardening store, and can you find me some leads on a gardening podcast? That might help. But and also sponsoring a podcast.
Okay, I know you're doing like some more broad-based that you're, I guess, doing the prep work for, but I mean, like when your podcasts are Salinas Underground and Salinas Soccer.
No, it's San Jose Earthquakes of Major League Soccer.
Okay, well, sure. But, how do you judge the podcasts? Because let's say you've got, a bakery, or let's say you have, yard service. And you may not necessarily need, underground or soccer podcasts.
That's
what he's saying is find the one that's relevant to what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what companies like us are doing, is you reach out to us and you say, okay, which podcast under your network or podcasts out there
right.
do you know? I mean, I wish it was simpler, and if we can figure out, we're going to get rich quicker.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, currently right now you have it's on the person to find this relevant podcast, and that's why we created a company out of it. And now you can reach out to Bytes Media, and again, we've been in this for 5 years. We have a very good feel for where the market is. And yeah, again, I agree with you that if somebody can figure that out, and Google and Apple are in a war right now for podcasts, and they're gonna really help a lot, I believe. Google 3 or 4 months ago finally released a standalone app for podcasts. They separated it from their Google Music service. So, and we've not seen really much. Spotify, when Spotify jumped into podcasts, that's the one that really helped us. But again, you can't go on Spotify as a listener and say, hey, my gardening company needs a podcast. So that's something that us as creators are working on for sure.
I mean, you could go in and try to search for like gardening or something.
Yeah, at this point you just go on Google and put gardening podcasts and.
Or not just Google, but like if you go into like.
You could go into the iPhone app, right? The podcast app and search.
Yeah, well, iPhone also separated podcasts from their iTunes store, but they didn't announce it. They just did it with one of their iOS updates.
Mhm.
So all of a sudden people couldn't find our podcast, and we tell people, oh, you gotta find, I always tell them, find the blue, there's a blue square somewhere in your app
Yeah.
dashboard. That's the podcast one. And people start scrolling.
Yeah, I remember when they did that, and I'm like, where did all my podcasts go? Because I listen to podcasts all the time.
Yeah, and again, that's what's, as creators, we're kind of at the whims of these multi-billion-dollar companies, and that's why also a big reason why I kind of wanted to start this company, to start, again, going back to the influencing thing. The bigger we get, the more influential we get within the industry, the more we can kind of dictate, you know, what the industry does. And yeah, so that's what's so neat about being at this level, you know, there's so much excitement.
Going with a local podcast such as Salinas Underground would be beneficial to a local business just because we are local. And he'll get into it in a bit, the reach and
That's
the
huge.
followers and the exposure of it.
Yeah, so if you are like bricks and mortar and you're in a community like
Mhm.
Salinas or Santa Cruz, getting onto like a regional podcast like that, that's like just about the community
Yeah.
would be.
And that's
Really
again
good.
where I feel we're pioneering
It's
that
tied
as
into-
well.
Yeah, and it's tied into the social media as well, which has
So you get
Another
promoted,
following.
you're not just getting promoted through the podcast,
no.
but you're
The
getting
social
promoted
media.
through
Mhm.
all
Oh,
social
hell
media,
yeah.
which is
And
huge.
you'll see that, and I get into that. Because right now, really, the monetization level is 15,000 downloads per episode, and that's when advertisers really start paying attention to you. And again, something like Salinas Underground, because we focus on that, 15,000 downloads per episode. That's 10% of the city downloading our podcast every week, and we would love that.
That's pretty good.
Well, I mean, that would be, if we can do that. We're
Oh,
nowhere
okay.
near that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I don't believe we ever will be. But that doesn't mean that we're not marketable or that we can't help, again, the feed store down the street.
Well,
Right.
have you ever considered, like, expanding beyond the city? Or
Yeah,
just-
again, we have 2 podcasts in pre-production, like I mentioned earlier, that are doing that. Creating a podcast is a really tremendous amount of work with all the scripts and the schedules and the editing and all that. It's the
And
whole.
the sound editing
Is
is
that-
so important. Oh my god. So
Yeah.
I can't listen to a podcast that has bad sound.
That's one thing, again, also that knowing that our first podcast would not hit this threshold of 15,000 downloads, I before this was even a company, I said our sound quality must be the best. We have to push the equipment that we have to get the best possible sound out of this, because we're talking about Salinas, you know,
Right.
and that's what we've been huge on, and again, that's, you know, football without hesitation, that equipment, quality is huge. Quality is
There's
huge
even
for
a
us.
huge podcast for 48 hours, and their sound quality is so bad. You have to turn the radio way up when they're actually talking, and then they have a commercial break, and you get deafened.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you guys are a major corporation. Like, what are you doing?
Well, and see, this is also, there's very little standards in podcasts as well. And that's another, and I pulled it out of my presentation here, but in December 2017, this company, the IAB, who sets advertising standards for digital and the online marketplace, set standards for what constitutes a download.
Oh.
Before December 2017, it was.
So this is so much of this is like still
Oh yeah.
newly forming.
This is happening right now. The Google app came out in May, you know, and so this is where I feel that the industry right now is just
This is
looking for
21st
podcasts
century.
over 15,000 downloads. But I'm thinking, what about the podcast from 1 to 15,000 downloads? Yeah, if you have a national politics podcast and that's your level, then you got to work on stuff. But if I'm getting 15,000 downloads talking about something locally, that's huge. You know, that matters. But right now, there's nobody there, you know, helping these podcasts or trying to develop some kind of model to, you know, to sell these things. Because right now, again, it's CPM, and if cost per thousand, I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, but in podcasting, it's cost per thousand downloads. Right now, the range goes from $35 to $100, which is extremely cheap when you're talking about other forms of media. But again, if you're looking at that minimum threshold of 15,000 downloads, if a podcast charges a local business $40 per every 1,000 downloads, that's $600. That might be worth it for a local business. It probably is not. And I don't know how many, again, I think of, I keep bringing up the pet store, my friends have a pet store. So they don't have $600 to sponsor one episode. We come up with 4 episodes a month. The message is gonna get drowned out.
So it could be much more affordable for something on a small
Yeah,
scale.
yeah, and that's why I put that again. Smaller shows will probably charge, and that's what we're doing. Is we bundle our social media. You know, it's a package. You know, you don't just pay to sponsor the show. We're also gonna put social media posts, and again, that's where we put a whole bunch of effort, and that's where we get a whole bunch of traction.
Okay.
So it can get expensive. Again, answering the question, is it expensive? It can be, especially if you start your own. Going back to quality, you can really start a podcast with just your phone, but like those days of those shows getting popular are getting fewer and farther between. More and more people are expecting quality. They're expecting more professional behavior. Again, it used to, a podcaster going into your business and saying, "Hey, will you give me $100 for a show?" That's not going to cut it anymore. In 6
Yeah.
months or a year, whatever, no one's gonna.
So
pay
are the
attention to you.
30-second commercial spots, or the like embedded in it, or how does that work?
Mm-hmm.
The ones we do are embedded. There's a big shift into dynamically inserted ads. There's a company called Panoply is it called Megaphone or something? They bought a company called Megaphone that somehow figured out how to do dynamically inserted ads. So again, this would be the kind of fresh content type thing.
Mhm.
So if I, say the Rodeo sponsors a show and said, "Oh, go to the Rodeo July 28th, 2017."
I
And
see.
you listen to the podcast in 2019, that it's irrelevant.
Mhm.
But there are services coming out now that will dynamically insert ads through the lifetime of the podcast. So then you can sell, ads in a much different way that way as well.
That's important too, because like I said, I'm an avid podcast listener. I download at least 20 of them to my phone. I subscribe to them regularly, listen every time I'm driving. And yeah, when I discover a new podcast, I listen to it from the beginning. So if a podcast has been around for 4 years and I suddenly just got on my radar, then I'm starting with episode 1.
Yeah.
So maybe that's like also like a piece of advice for people to put more evergreen content into an advertisement that they're gonna do.
Yeah, especially,
podcast.
yeah,
Something that can be relevant.
Like local events, they're repetitive, but it's something new every week.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same, but it's fresh every week.
and that's part of also how we sell our services is that, hey, you local business, for this $200, it's gonna be there forever.
Right.
So as long as your tire shop is here, people are gonna be hearing about it, cause this is
But
on the
then they
internet.
might not necessarily wanna use that advertisement to then run a promotion for like, come in by Saturday, July 3rd,
No.
and you'll get your tires rotated for free. It's like,
Yeah.
that's not gonna be relevant in,
Exactly, and
Yeah.
that's where we would suggest, okay, we'll do a social
so you
media post
counsel,
for that.
so that you counsel people on it.
Yeah, exactly. You get, people they know so little about the social media part of it. But then also, this is what I really want to get a little bit of how we use social media. And again, this was my transition slide, and I was like 7 minutes just talking about this one here. Basically, this is what makes us different, or better, as I like to put, as a podcast production company. Because at this point, podcast production companies, probably like a dozen a week or something that are going to come up. But why are we different? And me and Brad, I don't know if Brad fully agrees with me, but we're not just download numbers. We're not just download numbers. And again, because there's a reckoning coming. The people don't have the real numbers that they do. Again, before December 2017, we had 190 episodes. If all of you subscribed to it, we would get 190 downloads every time you subscribe to it, whether or not you listen to a second
Yeah,
of
yeah.
it. And that was great, because then we could show businesses, hey, look at this. Our downloads just went up 800%. That doesn't mean anybody listened to it. And so podcasters are relying on kind of people not knowing this right now, but the reckoning is coming. And that's where, again, we want to be here throughout the whole thing. We don't want to be here until that happens, and then we're like, damn, now we don't have any downloads or any company. So that's where we are not just download numbers. We do much more than that. And again, this is where I said we understand the connection between social media listeners and our sponsors. So we also won't get a sponsor that just has a fat check. We understand what our listeners care about and what they react to, because we're so good at social media. So we kind of have a figure of who will be a good fit for us. And that's why, again, I would suggest any businesses come to us, because we've been trying to figure this out for years now, so we feel we have some kind of in there. And yeah, so again, we focus on niche topics. So another thing that we're doing, that I'm really focusing on, is creating influencers out of our hosts, well, me and my co-host. and yeah, that's another thing, is on our social media, we make a point to put our faces on there. To say, we are not just at this event, this is us physically here. And going through our reach for the last year, all of the highest reaching posts that reach the most people tend to have our faces on there. There's something there to that, I'm sure. But that's another thing, is that we want to make our hosts influencers. So this is not just a voice that tells you about the soccer scene last week. This is Oz Lucero. This you trust him. You want to follow him wherever he goes. And that, again, I think will increase our marketability, again, because we don't get 1 million downloads per episode. And this one is huge to me as well, is that this is one of the hottest platforms on the planet, and because of that, it's so expensive, again, for local businesses, and unfortunately, small businesses always get left out of these things. In 4 or 5 years, once everybody's doing it and it's super cheap, then a small business can get it. But we offer the ability for small businesses to get into this growing industry right now. I like to say, again, we offer San Francisco quality service in Salinas.